A warm welcome, please, for our first panelist, Ms. Xueling, Minister of State, Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Social and Family Development. Welcome, Minister. Thank you for being here. Our second panelist is Professor Wei-Jun Yeung, who is the President of the Population Association of Singapore. Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Patricia Tan, Executive Director, Russell Reynolds Associates, and Board of Director for Fertility Support SG. Our next panelist, Mr. Sumana Rajarethnam, Director of the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network, Southeast Asia, The Economist. Welcome, sir. And this panel will be moderated by Mr. Shai Ganu, who is the Managing Director and Global Leader, Executive Compensation and Board Advisory for Willis Towers Watson. Welcome, Mr. Shai Ganu.
Good morning. Wasn't that a wonderful way to get the morning started? We heard two fabulous keynote addresses that set the context really well for this conversation. First of all, I want to start this panel discussion by saying a big thank you to SCWO. SCWO does such meaningful work. There are countless people here, people like Junie, Georgette, and others, and we're all following your lead. So thank you for everything that you do to raise the collective consciousness of our ecosystem and our society. So we'll get started. My name is Shai, but some of you know I'm not really shy. And we want that theme to be in the panel as well, because this is a conversation. It's not scripted. We have some prepared questions, but we'll also have some time for questions from the floor. And in the spirit of not being scripted, I had originally sort of written a few notes for myself that I was going to open with. And then last night, I was speaking with my wife, and as most important things in my life, she has some very wise counsel. And she said, whatever you do, please make sure you address two things. One thing was, please make it abundantly clear that fertility or low fertility is not just a woman's problem. Right? And number two, her wise words, the topic that you're talking about, Asia's population is shrinking. In a Singapore context, what does this mean for women? It could mean opportunities, but it could also mean some concerns. If populations are declining, then more women have to go in, on the plus side, there are more opportunities for women, there are more jobs. But on the flip side, if populations are declining, you also have the caregiving responsibility, and particularly for women, caregiving responsibilities at both ends, children and parents. So how do we as a society, as an ecosystem, make sure that the right levers that women can be active participants in the workforce and actually help address some of these issues? So to address these issues, fortunately, you don't have to listen to me, you have to listen to the experts, and we are blessed to have a very stellar panel. I won't do them any disservice by introducing them from me. But what I might do is we'll get the ball rolling and ask each of the panelists to quickly introduce themselves in a couple of minutes, their area of work, and any topic that they're passionate about. Minister of State, maybe start with you, please.
Thank you, Shai. Definitely no need to be shy in a room filled with many women.
Indeed.
Who are very encouraging. So let's give our moderator a round of applause. I'm delighted to be here this morning amongst many friends. As some of you may know, I'm currently the Minister of State at the Ministry of Social and Family Development. I also have a concurrent portfolio at the Ministry of Home Affairs. I had the opportunity to work on the National White Paper on Women's Development, which could not have come together if not for the many CSOs, community partners that we have amongst us here today, chief of which is SCWO. Thank you, Junie. Thank you, Yen-san, and to your wonderful team, Yen-Ping and all, as well as your very important constituent members, such as AWARE. We have Dr. Kanwaljit Soin here, a real trailblazer when it comes to women's progress and development. United Women Singapore, we've got Financial Women's Association, we've got so many NTUC, we've got Nur Farahin, yes, as a representative, and of course many other women's organizations, She, as well as, I'm very sure, many of you, as well as our male allies, Center for Fathering, Xander. Xander, where are you, Xander? Yes, over there, right at the back, but an important foundation stone, cornerstone for our efforts. And I think you almost volunteered earlier to lead the next summit. So in the Women's White Paper, we talked about the areas whereby we could further women's progress, but very importantly, that it is done in partnership with men. So we touched on different domains, which were also elaborated on by Mr. President earlier, such as workplace fairness, flexible workplace arrangements. We talked about how we could better equip women, how we could also better protect them from violence and harm, and also mindset shifts, which are very, very important. And I'll touch on that further when we talk about what shrinking population can do, and the opportunities and the constraints that we may face.
Excellent.
So over to you, Shai.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. Professor Jean, do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And this is really exciting and important event and conference that you put together as CWO with so many partners. I think this is a really timely conference, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Jean Yeung. I am here actually today representing the Population Association of Singapore, which we established about 3 years ago during COVID time, actually. And I'm currently the president of this association. I've been here in Singapore for 16 years now. Of those 16 years, I was the professor in sociology department in NUS. And lately, I have transferred to the medical school in NUS. And lately, I also take up a joint appointment with A-STAR as the social science director at the Institute of Social Development and Human Potential. So I'm a sociologist. I don't know if there are any other sociologists here. And okay, great, thank you. And a demographer, so I'm happy to be here. That I noticed that recently population has become popular again. That several conferences I have attended to actually put population as the centerpiece of the theme. So I study how the socioeconomic changes in the society in the last half a century affected people's decision in when or whether they want to get married and have babies, migration to different places, and of course how they take care of families. Both older and younger generations. I also study how social policies affect family and children's well-being. So one example that I have been doing is looking at the paternity leave policies in not just Singapore, but other countries too, and how that affects family and children's well-being. Another example is looking at how some of the policies, recent changes, have affected people's decision on retirement, especially older women's retirement, and how that affect their cognitive and emotional well-being. So I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to a very exciting dialogue here today. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you, Professor Jean. Thank you. Patricia, may I invite you to just share a little bit about yourself and the topic of interest?
Sure. Thank you, Shai. Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia. On a day-to-day basis, I wear two hats. First, my full-time is the executive search, where I place boards as well as the C-suite. I've done this for 20 years, seeing people from all walks of life. And my nighttime, my second job is I'm part of a charity, Fertility Support SG. We have about 8,000 members who suffers recurring miscarriages, multiple rounds of IVF, and the group of women that struggling to have babies. We started in the year 2020. I'm very, very strong advocate. Would love to double click on the topic around workplace support. Just given my daytime job and my nighttime job, I'm just seeing the struggles that women going through. Personally, myself, I suffered 6.5 years infertility. I went through 7 rounds of IVF and 3 major surgeries while juggling a full-time job. Just saying that just kind of bring back so much memories, like so much I want to do for women and men as well, like to your point, that suffers. How can we normalize the conversation at workplace, and how can we provide them and support them through the different phases, especially the pre-motherhood? Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for sharing your journey and story as well. I'm sure these conversations are really important in furthering the collective consciousness here. Last but certainly not least, Sumana, do you want to please?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Patricia, for sharing that story. My name is Sumana Rajarethnam. I'm director of the Economist Corporate Network. And to introduce myself, I'll tell you a story of a taxi driver. We all have taxi driver stories. It was just after COVID. I was leaving my house to go to the airport to travel to Kuala Lumpur. I was very excited. Got into the taxi driver was a very chatty one. He asked me, what do you do for a living? So I said, I'm an economist. I look at macroeconomic policy, geopolitics, the business environment. I was very impressed with myself. I thought he would be impressed with me, but he turned around and he said, you guys, you get things wrong all the time. You tell me that Trump is going to win, he loses. You tell me prices are coming down, the price of chicken in the market, so expensive, We went on and on. I learned a lot about myself that day, but the thing I was very happy about was that I lived very close to the airport. And so, I know that we have time for questions, and, I ask you to channel your inner taxi driver with a healthy dose of skepticism. But what I'm interested in is, I talk a lot about economic growth and the models of economic growth, and we tend to be, the clients that I talk to, focus on growth. Right? And that seems to be the paradigm. And Simon Kuznets, who designed that measure of GDP, said that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be captured by how wealthy it is. And that's, I don't have an answer for that, but based on what Dr. Jennifer Scuba was saying, maybe we should think about alternative models of economic growth.
Well said. Thank you, and welcome. Excellent. So we'll now get started on the panel proper. We have a few questions that I'll go each of the panelists, but please feel free to jump in and sort of share each of your own views. We will have some time for Q&A from the floor, so I will prompt you at the right time, so start thinking about your questions. But perhaps to get started, Professor Jean, how do fertility and marriage trends differ across East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia? And what implications do these differences have for gender equality?
Thank you for that question. So I think this is a good question to start with. While fertility rate is declining across Asia, it's important to be reminded there's great heterogeneities across different regions. While in East Asia, where we often think that's Asia, but it's quite different from South Asia, and in fact, many countries in Southeast Asia. In South Asia, the fertility is declining, but where marriage rate is actually more or less still universal. Where in East Asia we have 15 to 20% of men and women who never married or never had a child. In some of the South Asian countries, we still have a total fertility rate of above 3 or even above 4. And the challenge for each region then is very different, and we need to remember that there are different challenges in different places. In South Asia, the marriage, 40 to 50% of the marriages are still child marriages, meaning that women are married at age 14, even 12, and that child marriages has research have shown that has all kinds of negative consequences on a woman's health and other kind of well-being. There's also, the gender inequality index in South Asia is much, much higher than in the other two regions. The access to education and employment there is low. In Asia, in India, for example, 1/3 of the women are in the labor market, and most of them are in informal economies where they're doing a lot of very minimum and jobs that they're working. So also the reproductive health, contraceptive access are not always there for these women in South Asia. So in those areas, we need to continue to pay attention to these challenges. Reducing the child marriages and continue to provide support for reproductive health and improve the education access for women and job opportunities. In East Asia, we have, as I say, the late marriages and a large percentage of men and women not getting married. That is a big challenge to all countries in East Asia. There, the biggest challenge we have is work-life balance or imbalance. And we still even here, we have domestic violence issues to solve. Women's opportunities and advancement opportunities at workplace. We still have glass ceiling issues that we have been talked about many times that really need to be solved. So it's worlds apart between East Asia and South Asia. And when you talk about Southeast Asia, it's very, very diverse. I often think it's the most diverse region in the world, and that you have very different challenges here. But we don't have time to get into all the details. Just want to remind people that East Asia is not Asia. Asia has a lot of other countries that are still struggling with many other different challenges that we in Singapore have the privilege and blessings to have been enjoying a lot of these benefits and privileges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jean. And your statements run close to home. I moved to Singapore 13 years ago from Sydney, and I had an American boss, and I was charged to grow a business in Asia. So a few months in, he asked me, so how's it going? What's the plans for Asia? What are your key learnings? And I said, my first key learning is there's no such thing as one single Asia. Yeah. It's very different, and that point is very well made. Again, in the spirit of challenging popular misconceptions, Sumana, maybe I can come to you. Growing up, I was taught that, few of us were taught that population explosion is a bad thing. And growing up, the rhetoric was, we need to control population. But now we're almost faced with a reverse situation that shrinking populations is a bad thing. Which is it? And is shrinking population actually a bad thing?
That's a difficult question. First, because you look pretty youthful. So growing up for you,
I'm
I
62.
don't know how long ago that was. But let's pull it back quite historically, and that notion came from Malthusian theory, and then in the 70s with the Club of Rome, which has largely been disproved that resources that we need to feed a growing population will just not be there. But we managed to figure that out, right? And so even though we did, many countries pursued populations to decrease fertility. And that brought about benefits, right? And when we think about some of the benefits, it is difficult to completely tie that to gender equality, but you can say that they led to some gender empowerment, right? Things like being able to choose, when you had a baby, how often you did, your access to reproductive rights, your access to education, things like that were easier as population pressures came down. And then now we are in the reverse situation where suddenly we are thinking, oh no, where are we going to get our economic growth from? How are we going to pay all our bills and things like that, right? And it's a very economic arguments, and I think that's a lot also about what Dr. Scuba was saying, right? How do we change that frame of how we are looking at it? So there's certainly a lot of benefits. Two things to look at is how did you get there, whether they are anti-natalist policies or they are pro-natalist policies to increase fertility. Are you taking away rights from women or from individuals? Those generally don't seem to work, and they're pretty expensive. And so then looking forward, I think we should ask ourselves, is a declining population necessarily a bad thing, right? Can we adopt to a labor model and a model of economic growth where we are looking at the welfare of the people on the planet and maximizing that rather than maximizing economic growth? And that's a very big sweeping statement, and I hope we can get into that a little bit more as we go on.
Fantastic. That's great counsel. And Professor Jean reminded me earlier as well that it may be a misconception that population in Asia is shrinking. That's Asia as a whole may not be the case. There are certain countries in which that's happening, but certainly the population growth rates are declining. And you've made some very valid comments, which hopefully we'll get through later on. But just moving on, Patricia, and how can we, I guess, normalize the conversations about infertility, and what role can public and corporate policies play in supporting women face these challenges?
Thank you. I think to normalize fertility, conversation around fertility, it comes in many forms. I think, first of all, public awareness is key. I think as part of the charity, we have been working closely with the government when it's really talking around how do we normalize, and the thing is, infertility is real, is a sickness, right? And how do we talk about so that people feel that they are, because I recall when personally going through that, I felt not worthy at all as a woman. I remember feeling that I wanted to divorce my husband. I didn't feel worthy at all. And now that we have members of 8,000 of them, and this theme still comes up, how do we make them feel that it is normal? And how do we provide the safe space and a platform and support, like what Dr. Jennifer mentioned, to provide them the community to know that it's okay, you're not alone, we are here to support you. And I think one of it is the public awareness, not just in the social setting, but in the corporate setting. And that's something that I myself, I mentioned earlier, I'm advocating, working with HR, working with the leaders, so that they know that the people who's going through infertility, whether it's women or men, that they can share, they can talk about it, and they can benefit it on if there's any benefits in place, which we can talk about in the second part. So it's both social and workplace.
I really love that, counsel, particularly normalizing these both in the social and corporate context. I mean, number of conversations that there is a disproportionate number of corporate small talk that is associated with children and children's activities. We shouldn't just assume, first of all, and even if there is a coworker who may or may not have children, that shouldn't necessarily be a conversation topic. It should be normalized as if any other colleague. So thank you for sharing that. Minister, if we may turn to you, please.
Shai, sorry, I was just thinking, I had some thoughts
Please.
listening to our fellow panelists. So if you would allow me to just make a few points. First and foremost, I was looking at the title, right? We all know that Singapore's total fertility rate reached a new low of 0.97.
Yes.
So we know that as a fact. At the same time, some of us may have the misperception that Singapore's population is shrinking. It isn't. Our citizen births still outnumber our citizen deaths. So our population is still growing, but it is not perhaps growing as much as we would like it to. And it's the rate, the pace of that growth is moderating. So we still have to pay attention to total fertility rate. But let us not have the misperception that our population is actually shrinking. That's the first point. The second point I would like to make is that a shrinking population, which we are not there yet, doesn't necessarily mean a less vibrant society.
Here, here.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We are working on many fronts on increasing productivity. For instance, when it comes to workplace productivity, for instance, when it comes to productive longevity, because we have, our residents, our citizens are living longer, living healthily longer, and therefore they are able to be productive in the workforce longer.
Indeed.
Yes? So that's the second point I'd like to make. And the third point I'd like to make is that to perhaps borrow a point that Mr. President made earlier, I think what we should be looking at as a goal is a Singapore society where every individual is encouraged to thrive and flourish, where he or she is enabled to do so, to reach full potential, and to have to enjoy a meaningful life. And I think if we get that right, get that balance right, then individuals, be they men or women, in their search and pursuit of happiness, meaning, and purpose, that, by the way, family formation, if it's something that they aspire towards, and our surveys do show that many of them do still aspire to forming families, would come naturally as part of that search for meaning, purpose, and happiness.
Indeed.
And the last point I'd like to make is that we have many singles amongst us. We should never, just because they choose to remain single, think that they are any less happy.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
that they are... So as part of creating a society where every individual thrives and flourishes, every individual should have choice.
Absolutely.
And that choice comes back to whether or not you want to be career-minded first, whether or not you want to start a family. That choice should be open and available to both men and women. Thank you. Over to you.
That's excellent counsel. Thank you. Very well said. And Minister, one of the questions that I was about to ask you, you've already addressed some of that, which is putting this in the context of Singapore, so thank you. But specifically, do you have any thoughts about what does this mean for women, and particularly women in the workforce? Because the conversation earlier about, and I really like Dr. Schumer's tagline, birth more, work more, care more. How would that apply in the context for women in Singapore?
I think what we're trying to do through many government policies and initiatives is to make the trade-offs less difficult, less painful. When women do not feel that they are disadvantaged in the workplace because they choose to start a family, when they feel that the community accepts them as they are, when they feel empowered as an individual, and I think when women are allowed to make their choices freely and to know that they have a clear shot at realizing their full potential, then I think for them, when they make that choice, whether or not it is to invest a little bit more time at work or a little bit more time in the family, whatever government policies and programs that we can do to make that balance more easily achieved, the trade-offs less painful, then I feel that our women will feel fulfilled and enabled and empowered, to pursue those aspirations. So the point about shared parental leave, about encouraging more men to take up their share of paternity leave, all that is very important. It's interesting when I go for dialogues, right, on conversations like this, I do actually have men who raise up their hand and say, how do we redefine success in our society so that men are given the opportunity to be more involved at home? And by the way, can we be taught the skills as to how we can be helpful at home?
Yes.
So I think Center for Fathering is doing a very good job.
Absolutely.
And a point on workplaces, sometimes the men, they feel a bit hesitant about taking paternity leave because they're concerned about how fellow male colleagues
see them. So it's not just an issue that women have with regards to glass ceilings and stigma. Men, I think, also suffer from some of these issues in the workplace as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Very well said. And I particularly appreciate your point about choices. I was in a conversation like this, and a very senior executive was asked a secret of her success, and she was asked, how do you reconcile all the sacrifices you've made? And it still gives me goosebumps. She said, I didn't make sacrifices, I made choices. Because choices is what got me to where I am, and the trade-offs. So thank you for that. Sumana, maybe we can come to you, and Minister has, I think, very clearly set the record straight about misconceptions about population growth or shrinking in Singapore. But how would this compare to some of the other countries and other parts, some of our neighboring populations? So specifically, which policies in East Asia have been successful in addressing population decline, and what lessons can Singapore learn from them?
Which policy? So the questions on policies, and I think that it's very difficult to identify some that have been successful, but give you a bit of context, because first I think that we should move away from our focus on that 2.1 fertility number, right? Because that doesn't count a lot of things. It doesn't count migration. It doesn't count the death rate. There's a lot to that number, and that can be a very misleading policy tool. But often that is what policies aim for, especially in East Asia. Now, you look at countries like South Korea, for example, over the last 16 years has spent $200 billion on trying to move their fertility rate up. Their fertility rate is 0.78, lowest in the world. Japan spends about 2% of its GDP trying to do that as well, with very limited success, right? And in fact, in Japan, some of the design of the policies are also very favorable, right? They have one of the longest paternity leaves, but that does not translate because of cultural factors. What the minister said, men just want to stay at home. They get pressure from the workplace that's just a sacrifice for them if they were to have to go and take care of their children. And I would flip it a little bit to say that, are there East Asian countries with policies that Singapore can learn from, to maybe what Singapore can contribute to those, right? And as the president said, on various measures of gender equality, Singapore is far ahead. And in fact, I think on two of them that pertain to the labor force, female participation in the labor force and relative equity in terms of the gender pay gap, according to international measures, that's a big lesson for other countries in East Asia especially, right? And the other thing also is that we tend to think of these as big countries as a whole, right? So Indonesia is one of these countries that is actually actively trying to reduce its fertility rate. So to introduce some of the policies that have been used elsewhere in Asia to slow that down. And, that is a very uneven application, because in Jakarta, the fertility rate is already lower than it is in Singapore, right? So I think we need to think about urban and sort of rural differences, especially in East Asia and in some of the other developing countries in Southeast Asia. So I would say that, in terms of policies, they can only do so much. They lift a little bit, but the biggest lift comes from cultural change, and that is something that's very hard to develop just through policies. Like, policies can be a bit of an incentive for that, but the real cultural change of, men helping out and leaning in, participating in household chores, things like that, that's very difficult.
Absolutely. As with all change, you need both the hardware and the software. Policy change tends to be the hardware, but the software is the mindset and the behaviors. Very well said. Patricia, perhaps if I can come to you, and in preparation for this panel, I was doing some homework and really dug a little deeper into the work that Fertility Singapore does. So kudos to you and the organization for everything that you do. But then, based on your experience, what changes would you advocate for, let's say, the hardware part in terms of policies? What is policies or support from governments and corporates that can actually help in this conversation?
How much time do we have here? Look, I think I'll break it up to two parts, right? That's a hard approach. There's a softer approach. I think from a hard approach, again, I believe is working hand in hand. I don't think it's one party or two parties. It's really everyone, societal as well as corporate. I think from a policy standpoint, at this point in time, we are only allowed to use up to a certain amount from MediSave for IVF. The truth of the matter is, IVF is very expensive. One round of IVF in the private sector is about 25,000 for one cycle. Even from the public, yes, we have the co-funding and also the MediSave, but subsequently of a certain cycle, after, the same price kicks in. And I've seen a lot of the community, members from our community come to us to say they just couldn't afford anymore. And my heart goes to them because they really want kids. Again, I'm talking about a group of the personal choice who really want kids and they can't have kids. And because of financial constraint, they couldn't. So that's one element. The corporate side, again, I've done a bit of a studies because of my day job and my night job. I've realized that there's certain companies that we can talk about it later, how they have done a much better inclusive when it comes to fertility benefits. How do they support the women and the men, in fact, going through the journey of fertility. On the softer side of things, like what Sumana mentioned, culture, support, softer side of things, how do we educate the leaders? How do we educate the people around, infertile patients or colleagues or co-workers? How do we provide the kind of support, softer side, so that they know that the culture allows them to take time off to pursue the motherhood dream, and then they can transition back. And I remember myself, didn't tell a single person in the office, didn't tell my boss. I have to literally take my annual leave to go for doctor's appointment, and sometimes goes up to 5 hours waiting and jabbing myself every single day and going through that, right? And in between of meetings and all. And frankly, I felt I was almost, I reckon I have a mild depression back then because I just couldn't juggle the work part. And I felt that work at that point had to take a toll, affected, and I felt that I wasn't putting my hand up for promotion. And I turned down great work opportunities because I knew I was just not in the right mental space to do that. I think workplace could definitely double click on that and to provide that kind of support and environment and safe platform for them.
Thank you again, Patricia. I appreciate that. And we all have to, in our respective workplaces, make sure that there is the right culture that people can have these conversations. So thank you for that. Professor Jean, just coming to you, because this theme is around policies, right? And generally there is two sides to every story. So the question, I guess, is what are the potential dangers or unintended consequences of policies that are aimed at increasing fertility, and particularly regarding, say, women's rights and autonomy?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. When we're so obsessed in reaching the fertility target of 2.1 or 1.5, whichever one it is dangerous, and you've seen this already in some countries, to start restricting access to reproductive health services, contraceptives, and there's also places that start to make divorce harder to obtain. Places where you said that you're starting to make, you need both men and women to agree to get a divorce, that kind of things. Or you think women are already getting too much education, they should be going back to the kitchen and so on. Those kind of things will backfire, as our keynote speakers has spoken. It is not necessary that highly educated women and higher income women are going to have fewer children or married less. In fact, research even back in 1990 in the United States has shown that more highly educated women have higher marriage rate and have more babies because they can afford to. And more recent studies in South Korea that shows that actually having a family, getting married and having a baby has become a luxury of sort. Only those who are highly educated and highly have resources, financial resources, can afford to form a family and have kids. So don't be thinking that if women have less education and not working as much, they're going to have babies. That's not going to happen. And we need to be careful about this. And I also mentioned the domestic violence, things that are prevalent in many countries, even in high income countries as well. So we want to be careful to have the emphasis in creating an environment that's family friendly. And as our keynote speaker has said, if men and women feel that there's a meaning and the joy of having a child, forming relationship, and there's a meaning in extend generation after generation in the society, that's when the environment would be conducive for men and women to want to have family and have babies. And, the fertility is a consequence of the institution has not adapted to this rapid change of women's role in increasing education and employment situation in the society. And what we need to do is to have these norms and institutions make enough and sufficiently quick adjustment to these changes so the environment do not lose this equilibrium again and regain this equilibrium where people think there's a point of recreating, a point of extending beyond this generation and not just working for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I love speaking to sociologists for that reason. You always have a different perspective, and I'm an engineer, and sometimes some of the things that I learn from my colleagues with a different perspective, just the unintended consequences of every action, it's really worth dwelling on that. So really appreciate your counsel there. Minister, clearly, coming to you, if you don't mind, clearly this is a multifaceted issue, and even on this round, sort of we've heard some pluses, some minuses. But if we can put this in context for Singapore, are there solutions beyond just having more children?
I'll come to that in a while. Perhaps I thought to also summarize what has been said.
Please.
I think there is a lot of value in what our keynote speaker, Jennifer, as well as what Professor Jean has just said. And I think Professor Jean made a very important point, that what we see in terms of total fertility rate and family formation is actually a consequence of what we see in terms of societal structure, in terms of workplace structure, and family dynamics. And coming back to a point that Mr. Sumana had made, when we looked at the difference in reproductive rates between, say, the urban city versus, for example, the rural outskirts, I think that one key differentiating factor is also the level of competitive stress that one feels in the city. And obviously, Singapore is a city-state, yes? So I think that because of societal structures, workplace structures, added to that, competitive stresses of working in the city, all that comes together to make for a very potent mix, whereby when everyone is caught up in this rat race, that forming a family doesn't naturally come into the equation. So I guess the question for us is, how do we try to address each and every one of those pain points, which comes back to my earlier point, as to how do we make trade-offs less painful, so that at the end of the day, individuals are enabled and empowered to make choices whereby they find meaning and purpose in their lives. And by the way, as part of a natural process, family formation, finding love, being with their family, having children because children bring joy to the family, I think that would become a natural consequence. So I think that's really the thing that we are trying to solve. I'll come back to the point also about government policies. I think what we have realized in Singapore, when we look at the experiences of many countries around us, is that policies around preschool education, policies around trying to lower the cost of raising children, lowering some of those thresholds, those are necessary, but perhaps insufficient.
Yeah, not sufficient. Yes.
Not sufficient, but necessary.
Absolutely.
Because if you do not have those programs and initiatives in the first place, the total fertility rate might be dropping at an even faster rate. Yes, and you might have more and more unhappy individuals in society. So I can't tell you what works, because everyone is experimenting. But we do know that there are certain policies and programs that we need to have in place, because otherwise people are not empowered and enabled to make their choices. Over.
Very well said. We still are figuring out what works, but we have a good idea of what doesn't work. And so let's stop what doesn't work through these policy interventions, through making it easier for people to have families. And I think the point was very well made. Singapore being sort of one of those few blue zones, one of the characteristics of the blue zone was the very strong social fabric and social structure and finding meaning and joy in your life. So very valid points from all panelists. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. So I will urge our audience to start thinking about questions. Thank you. Maybe there is a quick question.
Yes.
Please. The lady closest to the mic. Why don't you start first? Please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And sorry, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's truly inspiring to listen to the panelists, and I would like to thank the minister for giving such a valuable insights, and I'm grateful by listening to all of you. I would say, like, I'm here today to represent one of the oldest Indian women's club as a president, the Kamla Club. So after listening to all of you, I would say that at every level, name it as a corporate, a government, or at any, the managerial levels, please make an effort to know who has joined you, who's working with you, who's very young and who's yet to start a family. Please create a conducive atmosphere around them. Try to know, as a manager, I have worked. I try to talk more to my younger staff by knowing about them. So give them an atmosphere, create an atmosphere, and make it more conducive for them to be happy. End of the day, we all work. I mean, we are in a very, in a society where the financial status comes, you have to grow, you have to make yourself so So before that, create a very good atmosphere for these people. Know them. Just give them some moments, try to know them, and make them happy. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Just one simple word. A happiness can be a very pivotal role in anyone's life to grow and be happy, to create a family. Because, the progeny has to progress and go. So you have to have the young ladies. I request, please, in my 50s, I have been inspiration among the women, especially around me. So for the youngsters too, I have my daughter's childhood friend who's here. She's just into 20s, Anisha. So I tell you all, please, nothing comes to you. You have to go and look for the happiness.
Thank you.
That's what I'm saying.
Very
please,
well said.
Make family, make a...
Very well said. Thank you. That's
Thank
great, great comment.
Thank you.
And perhaps, before we go to the next question, Patricia, I know you had some examples of what corporates and companies can do to actually blend in with the comments that the lady was making about creating a better workforce, creating a happier workforce. Do you want to just share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I think there are few Let's put it this way, companies that's with a bit more progressive, who actually have a very comprehensive benefits in place that support their employees through different life phases, that including pre, during, and post. But of course, today I'm representing more on the pre. So I studied quite a bit by speaking with a lot of CHROs in whether it's banks, healthcare, manufacturing, and et cetera, and Singaporean firms, really talking about what kind of benefits. I would say at the moment they varies. There's a variation of some do better, some have more rooms to improve. But I would say the gold standards that I've seen from my lens is that not only they have the financial support through a very comprehensive medical / insurance coverage. They include IVF, they include egg freezing, they include IUI, etc., but at the same time, they provide the softer side, which is fertility leaves. That is paid fertility leaves. But of course, some may argue to say that, oh, but I don't want people to know I take fertility leave because ultimately it's still a very private matter. But that is an option that giving up to them, again, so that they could feel more comforted and through the journey.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
If I could just add on to that, the recent announcements around shared parental leave and paternity leave, to be honest, is not rocket science.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. The government has been thinking about it for years, but the difficulty is implementation and take-up.
Absolutely.
So if you look at the announcements we have made in terms of the timing of the rollout, we have staggered the rollout, right? For instance, when it came to paternity leave, we said the first 2 weeks, right, mandatory, next 2 weeks voluntary, and then we now say that from 2025, April onwards, the next 2 weeks, the additional 2 weeks will be made mandatory. Shared parental leave also staggered out.
Yes.
First 6 weeks in April 2025, and then full 10 weeks in April 2026,
Yes.
right? To be honest, it's far simpler for the government to just say, just roll out one shot. Why do we stagger it? Because we have to take into account the needs of employers. How do they restructure their workplaces? How do they ensure workplace workload allocation amongst their employees? But we do know, and employers do know, that a happy worker is a productive worker. So the question is, how do we all come together, sit around a table, and make sure that this policy is going to be properly executed, implemented on the ground, and that everyone is happy with the outcome?
Fantastic. Thank you. And it is clear that the thought process is nudging behavior changes. It could have been very easy to say, fell sweep, from today onwards, policy has changed. Yes. But we're trying to nudge the behaviors so that it also helps with the adoption rates.
So, don't mind, I just want one point, the nudging the behavior. There are often, you'll be surprised, leaders, C-suites, when someone shared with them, hi, I just had a miscarriage. You could see the blank face, and they quickly switch to another topic. And that we have seen we have heard so many examples. So coming to that culture, nudging behaviors. So awareness, education, providing the toolkits to the leaders, what to say, what not to say, not just leaders, workers, and HR as well. That is in the works, and hopefully we will be launching it by end of the year to all the corporates out there.
Thank you. That's excellent. Yes. Please, sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. Hi, my name's Linda Locke. Like you, I am an IVF warrior. Took me 5 times to have my now 28-year-old son, and I tried 7 more times to have another, but sadly failed. What I did manage to do, and I hope to the benefit of a lot of people, is persuade NUS, and therefore the government, to move from 3 tries to 10 tries. Because the stress of trying to achieve a baby in 3 tries is unbelievable. Okay? I'd like to talk about education, because at the tender age of 40, I was led to understand that actually, maybe they taught me in biology and I forgot, that every egg you were ever going to have as a woman, you have the day you're born.
Yeah.
Okay? Not the case for men. You can keep at it. But women are born with every egg. It's significant, because it literally means that my son was born with a 42-year-old egg. That chance of being able to achieve a pregnancy lowers. I was given 2%. I talk to friends who have daughters now about sex education, to the horror of their mothers, but the girls, funnily enough, agree with me, which is not to say, you know, don't have sex before you're married and all the rest of it, but to explain the consequences, which I don't think is educated enough. The number of women I saw during my IVF sessions who had lost fertility due to their sexual behavior, okay? I'm not condemning anybody. I'm just saying you could have had one boyfriend and then marry the next man, but something happened and it caused damage. So to think very, very carefully about your behavior because, to your point, it has consequences, okay?
Thank you.
The third thing I wanted to raise as well is the area of egg freezing. If I had been better educated, I think I would have chosen to have my eggs frozen because I knew I wanted a baby. And I lived in an era where the choices were not under the sort of financial pressures that couples find themselves in today. Now a lot of women don't want to have the baby until they can financially support the family, and then when they want the baby, her eggs are too old. So that's where the government could perhaps help. The government program in IVF, by the way, for me, I did all through NUS, is magnificent. And my baby was born in NUS. But it was still $9,000, $10,000 in 1992. So I can't imagine even in the government sector now what price would be. So these are areas I think can help. And then to your point, Patricia, I agree with you. I'm also an advertising veteran of some 35 years and then marketing. One of the most stressful jobs you could do. The only time I ever succeeded was I took 2 weeks off unpaid work and had all my calls, faxes, we had faxes then, emails, everything cut off. So I do think we can do a lot more at the education level for children, both boys and men, because boys want to become fathers too, to think about what they're doing as well. And I think you could help start the process much, much earlier and be more successful and avoid the basic fertility problems in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story as well. Appreciate it. Sumana, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll respond quickly to that on two fronts. One is my thinking around policy design for governments, right, and why this is difficult. So assisted reproductive technology is important and it should be made available from an individual rights perspective, right? But when you're a government and you're designing policy, you know, 90% of births and pregnancies are the traditional way.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you need to really think about what that means in the mix of your policy design and what it costs and where you're putting money to, right? And so I think that's where there's a lot of difficulty for governments to say, okay, we need to reduce the cost of this because fiscally it's difficult to reappropriate that, right? And so it is, I think from a rights perspective, very important what you're saying. It's very tricky, the trade-off from a government policy design perspective. Agreed. From an education perspective, you know, we were asked to think about one practical thing. And in, you know, education curriculum, Singapore, we do it pretty well. Yeah. But, you know, all across the world, if fertility is declining, maybe we need to talk both about things like contraception and, you know, safe sex, but also about how to have babies and how to have relationships, you know, and that could be part of the education curriculum.
Very well said. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, but similar to this strand, perhaps, and Professor Jean, I know we spoke earlier about specific issues regarding aging women in a declining population, especially those without family support. What counsel do you have around that?
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. You know, older women are going to be one of the most valuable source of labor market with the declining and shrinking of the labor market that we're seeing. So, you know, it's wise to invest in women of all ages, of course, but older women too. Be careful that we want to make sure they have the same access and right to the labor market, not to be forced into retiring earlier than men, and expecting them to do a lot of unpaid labor. Our data shows that they're spending so much time in grandparenting, in taking care of family members that are sick and so on. And we also know that women work shorter period of time and in lower wage jobs too. So their financial adequacy and financial security is so important. We also know that women live longer than men. So at the end of life, they're much more likely to be living alone themselves. So the risk of becoming isolated and socially excluded from all kinds of other activities is critical, and that research has shown that it could lead to cognitive impairment, decline much faster, and also physically, it's not a good thing. So we really need to pay a lot of attention about policies for older women as well.
Thank you. Very well said. I want to start rounding up the conversation because we're getting the sense of the timer, but we spoke a couple of times about the role men play in this equation. Sumana, I'm not just asking this because you're a man, but as an economist and the research that you've done, what's the role men can play in this equation?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not going to say men can't do anything because I won't make it out of the room. But, I think that we need to reconceive the notion of labor. And some of the other panels in the afternoon are going to talk about this. Dr. Jennifer talked about how many roles women have to play. Sociologists called when they, play a role at work and then come home, that is sort of the second shift. But also even at work, there's this notion of the anticipatory burden of labor. So you're thinking about what you have to do for your kid, sign up for that summer camp or whatever it is, make sure their tuition teachers paid, all of these things, or even taking care of your sick kid. Often those things fall on women, and they fall on women when they are in the office and working, right? And so I think that is one of the big roles that men can play, is to really sort of lean into those responsibilities at home and with your children, with your parents. It doesn't need to just be with your children, right? So I think that's we have run out of time, but that's what I'd like to say. As
my wife says, help me with the mental load. Everything else we can figure out, but help me with the mental load. Thank you. We have time for one last question, and we're standing between you and lunch, so if we can keep this question brief, please.
Is this microphone on? Okay, yeah, great. So I wanted to thank everybody for speaking, and also to address the previous speaker when she was talking about social egg freezing. I know there's a lot of news on social egg freezing, and it's good that everybody's trying to raise the fertility rate. But I also want to talk about the fact that science research shows that out of 19 eggs that can be retrieved from the lady, at the most, perhaps one might result in a live birth. So I know a lot of people are putting their hopes, especially the young women, they're putting their hopes into freezing eggs, perhaps even earlier, maybe at 21, as one of the other speakers was talking about her regret at not doing that. But the reality is that to retrieve the eggs and to actually make it into a good frozen state, the egg is, from a biological perspective, a lot of the protective natural qualities of the eggs have to actually be shaved off in order to freeze the egg, and the egg doesn't actually get frozen in time. There's a very slow process of aging still. So essentially the egg is not perfectly preserved as what is being often believed. So I would like to caution that in the government policies, that we don't sell it as a one-off solution, and definitely that we could put the funds into, of course, educating women on the fact that fertility drops as we age. And perhaps there's also, from an economic point of view, I appreciate the fact that Ms. Patricia, has gone through a lot to conceive her children, and it's something where a lot of women have that hope to have children. But we have to explore other avenues rather than just putting everything into IVF, especially with increasing the beds at KK. I know that's
thank you.
To help, but let's look into other policies as well, not make it one-sided into IVF. Thank you very much.
Very well said. Thank you. Thank you. I know we are at the end of our time, but given the theme of this summit was action, I will play my moderator's privilege and extend time a little bit. I will ask each of our panelists to just in 30 seconds share one actionable item that you have. Minister gets slightly longer. No. Sumana, if we may start with you, we'll end with Minister. We'll start with you. One actionable item.
All right. So I talked about
Education.
Education. I think another one is to refocus from that 2.1 number and start thinking about a floor instead, right? So instead of 2.1 fertility, what is the floor that we need in order to preserve what we want in society?
Great. Thank you. Patricia?
I think for me, it will be definitely encouraging more companies to drive more awareness and education across the leaders so that it provide women and men that are undergoing fertility with a much safer, conducive environment. Yeah.
Very well said. Professor Jean?
So I'll put in my sociologist hat now to emphasize on the changing of social norms, and my educator's hat too. I think in the education system, we need to start very early on in reducing the stereotypes of what man and woman's role should be. We're still reading Snow Whites, we're still reading Rapunzels, and we need better materials at the preschool and elementary schools. Change everyone's mindset. If having baby is what everyone wants, and as every National Day speeches start with, we need to have more babies. It's a common good. So we have agree that it's a common good, not just good for the individual parent and families, and therefore everyone needs to chip in and pay a price. Employers, educators, and government and community, as we said. So thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Minister, please, any closing thoughts as well?
We can all play a role in reducing trade-offs from men and women in the workplace and when it comes to caregiving responsibilities at home.
Yeah.
So I hope we can all take action, whether or not we come from the government sector, as an employer, as an employee yourself, or as a community partner. So let us try to make the outcomes of shared parental leave, paternity leave, flexible workplace arrangements, a reality. Thank you.
Oh, very well said. Thank you. All right, with that wonderful conversation, we will end today's session. I'm sure some of us will be here for lunch, so if you want to chat separately. But I'll leave you with one thought, which again, my very wise wife said to me last night. When was the last time, she said, you saw a headline that said, men having babies late to be blamed for economic downturn? We've not seen that headline. It takes a village, and quite literally in our case, it takes a nation to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Sun, Professor Yeung, Ms. Tan, Mr. Sumana, and Mr. Shai Ganu.